People always ask me what the strangest job I've ever taken was, and they usually expect some story about restoring an old church bell or forging decorative hinges for a mansion that had been standing since the Civil War. They never expect me to tell them the strangest commission came from the same woman who spent weeks trying to destroy my business. Even now, every time I drive through Maple Ridge Estates and see that massive iron entrance gate standing there without the slightest sag, I can't help but laugh. Because the woman who once called my forge a dangerous menace ended up begging me to save the very neighborhood she claimed I was threatening. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 39 years old, a third-generation blacksmith, and unlike most people who think blacksmithing disappeared sometime around the invention of electricity, I've spent my entire adult life proving that some of the oldest crafts in the world still matter. My grandfather forged farm equipment in Kentucky. My father specialized in restoration work for historic courthouses and churches across the Southeast. I took a different path. After high school, I spent almost 6 years studying traditional ironwork in northern England, under craftsmen who treated every hammer strike like a sentence, in a language that had survived hundreds of years. They taught me patience before speed, precision before profit, and one lesson I still carry with me every day: steel never lies. If you cut corners, the metal remembers. When I came back to the United States, I wasn't interested in opening another welding shop that churned out railings by the dozen. I wanted to build something authentic, something people could actually watch and understand. So in 2021, I bought a house just outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a subdivision called Maple Ridge Estates. The property had a detached workshop and enough backyard space to build a traditional coal forge without bothering my neighbors. Before I ever lit the first fire, I spent months collecting permits, meeting county inspectors, talking with insurance companies, installing modern fire suppression equipment, ventilation systems, emergency shutoffs, and every safety measure anyone could reasonably ask for. I even invited the county fire marshal over after everything was finished, just because I wanted another pair of eyes looking at it. He walked around for nearly an hour before smiling and saying, "Honestly, Ethan, this place is probably safer than half the barbecue pits around town." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Business started slowly, then picked up faster than I expected. Historical museums hired me to reproduce 18th century hardware. Wealthy homeowners restoring old estates wanted hand-forged gates, lantern brackets, and door hardware that looked original. Architects called whenever modern factories couldn't replicate period ironwork. Some weekends, parents would stop outside the fence with their kids just to watch sparks fly while I worked. I'd wave, explain what I was making, sometimes hand a child an unfinished horseshoe. Those moments reminded me why I'd chosen this career in the first place. Most people had never seen a real forge before. They'd only seen blacksmiths in movies. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed because someone decided smoke automatically meant danger. I heard tires crunch across my driveway and looked up to see a white luxury SUV parked beside my mailbox. Out stepped a woman in her early 50s wearing expensive sunglasses, spotless white sneakers, and the expression of someone who'd already decided she wasn't going to like whatever she found. She walked through my open gate without introducing herself. "So this is the problem," she said, staring at the forge where I was heating a section of wrought iron. I set my hammer down and smiled. "Morning. Can I help you?" She folded her arms. "I'm Linda Prescott, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association." I nodded. "Nice to finally meet you." She didn't smile back. Instead, she pointed toward the thin column of smoke drifting straight into the sky. "We've received complaints." "From who?" I asked. "Residents concerned about fire hazards, pollution, property values." She paused dramatically. "Frankly, this looks more like an industrial operation than a family neighborhood." I glanced around. Birds were still chirping. My forge chimney was pulling smoke exactly the way it was designed to. Nothing looked remotely dangerous. "Everything here is fully permitted," I said calmly. "County approved. Fire marshal inspected it. Insurance company approved it too." She barely looked at the paperwork I offered. "Permits don't mean the HOA has to allow something this disruptive." That caught my attention. "Disruptive?" She gestured toward my anvil. "You're literally burning coal behind residential homes." I couldn't help smiling a little. "Ma'am, my neighbor grills steaks every Saturday with more smoke than this forge produces in a week." She didn't appreciate the joke. Her face tightened. "You'll be receiving formal notice." Then she turned around and left without another word. Watching her drive away, I had the uncomfortable feeling that this wasn't about smoke at all. Some people walk into a room looking for problems because solving problems makes them feel important. Others walk in already convinced they're the smartest person there. Linda struck me as someone who desperately needed to be both. I had no idea that before the month was over, she'd be threatening to fine me $1,000 a day, calling engineers who had never even stepped onto my property, and accidentally setting in motion the biggest act of karma I'd ever witnessed. The formal notice arrived 2 days later, delivered by certified mail as if I had committed some kind of environmental crime instead of making 18th-century door hinges. Linda hadn't exaggerated the threat either. According to the letter, my forge represented an unacceptable safety risk, an industrial nuisance, and a violation of the HOA's interpretation of community standards. The last page listed proposed fines of $1,000 per day if I failed to dismantle the forge within 10 business days. I remember sitting at my workbench reading it twice before laughing out loud because almost every accusation contradicted reports from the county agencies that had already inspected the property. Still, I knew enough about HOA politics to understand that logic rarely defeated someone who believed authority automatically made them right. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was curiosity. Why was she pushing so hard? I hadn't received complaints from my neighbors. Quite the opposite. My next-door neighbor, retired schoolteacher Martha Reynolds, often brought lemonade out while I worked and loved telling visitors that my shop sounded like history coming back to life. Across the street, a young couple had hired me to build custom fireplace tools only a month earlier. Nobody had ever hinted there was a problem. Then Martha stopped by that afternoon holding her own copy of the HOA newsletter. "You might want to read page 3, she said quietly. Buried between announcements about landscaping rules and the annual pool party was a paragraph describing unauthorized industrial activities that supposedly threatened neighborhood safety. It never mentioned my name, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew who it was talking about. Linda had already started shaping the narrative before anyone heard my side. That bothered me far more than the fines themselves. So instead of firing back with lawyers immediately, I invited every board member to visit the forge in person. Only one accepted. His name was Daniel Brooks, an accountant who admitted he had never seen a blacksmith shop before. He walked through every corner of my workshop, inspected the extinguishers, measured clearances around the forge, watched me demonstrate emergency shut-off procedures, then shook his head. "Honestly," he said, "this is cleaner than my garage." A week later, I learned Linda never shared his observations with the rest of the board. Instead, she hired a private structural consultant named Harold Simmons. The strange part was that Harold never called me, never knocked on my door, never requested access. He produced a 12-page report based entirely on photographs Linda had taken through my fence while I was away delivering a restoration project to Charleston. According to his report, my forge was primitive, unstable, poorly ventilated, and likely to cause catastrophic fire damage. Reading it felt surreal because he described equipment that literally didn't exist. He even misidentified my gas emergency backup system as a fuel storage hazard. That's when my patience turned into determination. I contacted the North Carolina Historical Preservation Commission and requested an independent evaluation. If someone wanted expert opinions, I figured they should come from people who actually understood traditional metallurgy. 3 weeks later, Dr. Samuel Whitaker pulled into my driveway in an old state vehicle with 2 clipboards and the kind of calm confidence that comes from spending 40 years studying metal. He didn't rush. He measured airflow. He tested temperatures around surrounding structures. He inspected my chimney, suppression systems, foundation, storage cabinets, everything. We talked about forge welding, historical iron composition, and why modern welds sometimes fail where older methods survive centuries. Before leaving, he looked around one last time and smiled. "You know," he said, "if more commercial shops followed safety practices like yours, I'd have a much easier job." His written report completely dismantled Harold's conclusions. It described my forge as exemplary, professionally maintained, historically accurate, and exceeding every applicable safety recommendation. I honestly thought that would end the dispute. I underestimated Linda's pride. Instead of withdrawing the complaint, she announced a special HOA meeting to vote on forcing removal anyway. The agenda made it sound as though they were protecting the community from some imminent disaster. Neighbors started asking me questions while walking their dogs. Some were embarrassed. Others apologized because they believed the newsletter. One father told me, "I brought my son over here last month. He still talks about watching you make that horseshoe. I can't believe they're calling this dangerous." I appreciated the support, but I also knew public opinion didn't always influence HOA boards. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. Tuesday morning changed everything. My phone rang before 7. It was Martha. "Ethan," she said breathlessly, "you need to come see the front entrance." By the time I arrived, police cruisers had already blocked half the road. Maple Ridge's massive decorative iron gate had collapsed overnight. One entire side lay twisted across the entrance lane while the second support post leaned at an angle that looked ready to follow. The neighborhood's showpiece had become an expensive pile of bent steel. Residents stood around taking pictures while contractors scratched their heads. Linda arrived a few minutes later wearing the same determined expression I'd seen the first day she walked into my shop. But this time something else sat underneath it. Panic. She spotted me in the crowd and immediately looked away. I crouched beside the fallen structure and within 30 seconds noticed the first problem. The primary welds connecting the load-bearing brackets had almost no penetration. Someone had created beautiful surface beads that looked impressive after paint covered them, but structurally, they were weak. Worse, the support tubes had never been properly stress-relieved after fabrication. Years of opening and closing the gate had concentrated fatigue in exactly the same locations until both sides failed almost simultaneously. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place. By lunchtime, 6 fabrication companies had inspected the damage. Their estimates spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. 8 to 12 weeks minimum. Costs ranging from nearly $200,000 to well over $250,000. Complete replacement instead of repair. Residents were furious because delivery trucks, emergency vehicles, and contractors were already struggling with temporary access. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same board preparing to outlaw a blacksmith suddenly couldn't find anyone capable of repairing a complicated iron structure. That evening, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I answered anyway. "Mr. Mercer?" Linda's voice sounded strangely soft. "Yes. Would you be willing to take a look at the entrance gate?" There was a long pause. "I thought ironwork like mine didn't belong in residential neighborhoods," I replied. Silence. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, "This is different." I almost laughed. "No, Linda, it's exactly the same." She asked what it would cost just to inspect it. I agreed because damaged metal has always fascinated me more than damaged egos. The next morning, I spent nearly 2 hours examining every failed joint. The more I looked, the worse it became. Whoever fabricated the original gate had prioritized appearance over engineering. Decorative welds hid structural shortcuts. Internal reinforcement stopped several inches short of where it should have continued. None of the major joints showed evidence of proper load testing. "It was built to impress people," I finally said to the board members standing nearby, "not to survive 20 years of daily use." One director quietly asked if it could be saved. "Yes," I answered, "but not the easy way." I explained exactly how I'd rebuild it using forge-welded reinforcement, properly normalized steel, hand-fitted joints, and modern structural calculations combined with traditional techniques. Then I gave them my estimate, $49,000, 4 weeks. Every board member looked relieved. Even Linda managed to smile. "That's remarkably reasonable," she said. I nodded. "Because I'm repairing it, not replacing it." She slid the proposed contract across the table. At first glance, everything looked fine. Then I reached the final page. Hidden beneath the payment terms was one additional clause stating that as part of the agreement, I would voluntarily remove my backyard forge upon project completion at no additional compensation. I read it twice, closed the folder, stood up without saying a word, and walked toward the door. "Wait," Linda called after me. "You seriously walking away?" I turned around calmly. "You don't need a blacksmith, remember? You need one less dangerous structure in the neighborhood." Her face went pale as the room fell completely silent. Then I opened the door and left, fully expecting never to hear from her again. I was wrong. Less than 2 hours later, my phone rang once more, and this time the conversation would change everything. The second time Linda called, she didn't sound like the confident HOA president who had marched into my backyard a month earlier acting as if she owned the neighborhood. She sounded exhausted. Before I could say a word, she sighed and said, "Mr. Mercer, Ethan, I made a mistake." Those 5 words probably cost her more pride than the $49,000 sitting on the contract. She admitted the board had rejected every other proposal because none of the contractors could guarantee the entrance would be operational before the start of the school year, and every extra week meant angry homeowners, delayed deliveries, falling property values, and endless complaints. "The contract has been rewritten," she continued quietly. No additional conditions. No changes. Exactly as you proposed. I drove to the clubhouse that afternoon, read every page twice, then looked up at her. If I sign this, we're done talking about my forge. She nodded. Yes, no more inspections. Yes, no more fines. Yes, no more fines. Yes, I signed. 4 weeks later, my workshop became the busiest it had ever been. I salvaged every piece of reusable iron, forged new reinforcement by hand, normalized every load-bearing component, and rebuilt the entire gate the way it should have been built the first time. Some afternoons residents gathered outside my fence just to watch. The same children who had once asked whether my shop was dangerous were now cheering every time. Sparks flew across the anvil. Even adults who had believed the HOA newsletter started bringing coffee or homemade cookies while asking questions about traditional blacksmithing. One older gentleman smiled and said, "I spent 30 years in construction, and this is the first time I've actually seen someone fix the problem instead of hiding it." That meant more to me than he probably realized. Installation day felt strangely emotional. As the rebuilt gate slowly swung into place, you could hear almost complete silence from the crowd. Every hinge moved effortlessly, every joint lined up perfectly. After the final inspection, I demonstrated the structural testing I promised. Each reinforced support exceeded 4,000 pounds of load without measurable deflection. The consulting engineer hired by the insurance company simply folded his clipboard and laughed. "This gate will probably outlive every one of us." Linda stood several feet away watching everything unfold. She thanked me in front of the board, but something about her expression told me she understood this wasn't really about the gate anymore. 3 months later, the truth finally surfaced. During an independent financial review requested by homeowners, investigators uncovered emails showing that the original gate contractor had warned the HOA nearly 2 years earlier about fatigue cracks developing inside the support assemblies. Temporary repairs had been recommended along with regular inspections. Linda and 2 board members ignored every warning because they didn't want to approve additional maintenance expenses before re-election. Suddenly, the entire story made sense. While she had been obsessing over smoke coming from my forge, the real danger had been standing at the neighborhood entrance the entire time. Residents were furious. At the next HOA election, Linda resigned before the vote even began. Several board members followed her out the door. I never celebrated her downfall because, honestly, there wasn't much satisfaction in watching someone destroy their own reputation. Actions have a way of doing that without any help. As for me, life became busier than I ever imagined. 9 homeowners hired me for custom projects after seeing the rebuild gate. Local historical societies invited me to demonstrate traditional forging. I started weekend blacksmithing workshops that filled months in advance, creating an entirely new source of income that eventually brought in more than $6,000 every month. The forge that had nearly been torn down became one of the neighborhood's most recognizable landmarks. Sometimes people still stop while I'm working and ask if this is the famous shop that rebuilt the Maple Ridge Gate. I usually smile, wipe my hands on my leather apron, and tell them the gate isn't the interesting part of the story. The interesting part is how often people mistake unfamiliar things for dangerous ones, while completely ignoring the real problems hiding in plain sight. Steel has taught me that appearances can fool almost anyone. A shiny weld can be weak. An ugly piece of iron can last 200 years. And sometimes, the loudest person claiming to protect everyone is the one overlooking the biggest risk of all. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have walked away after reading that first contract? Or would you have accepted the job anyway? And do you think Linda deserved a second chance after finally admitting she was wrong? Or had she already crossed the line long before that phone call? Let me know in the comments because I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand. And if this story reminded you of someone you've dealt with, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes real craftsmanship, real accountability, and real integrity never go out of style.